Okay, so let's talk about the motor unit. The motor unit refers to the part of the nerve and the muscles which is innervated by that particular nerve. So all spinal nerves have their own respective motor units. So motor unit is typically comprised of a motor neuron body, efferent fibers which carry the motor impulses, then the motor end plate through which the neurotransmitters get transmitted to the muscle, and then you have the actual innervated muscle fibers. So this is an example of a motor unit. So this is in fact how a spinal cord talks to a muscle. And this is called as the final step of neuromuscular execution. And this is a very interesting as well as important phenomenon of motor movement. So basically you have the alpha motor neuron, you have the gamma motor neurons, and then you have something called as the muscle spindles. So we will talk about it in the subsequent slides, but it's very important to know this. Let me give you a brief overview of how this works. Now you have something called as the muscle spindles, which are embedded deep within the muscle. So these are examples of muscle spindles, and they are also called as intrafusal muscle fibers because they are located deep within the muscle. And then externally, you see also muscle fibers, and they are called as extrafusal muscle fibers. Now, basically, the difference between the muscle spindle or intrafusal muscle fibers and extrafusal muscle fibers are that muscle spindles basically detect changes in length of the muscle. So if you were to stretch your muscle, which you would do when you want to grab an item or something, and then the change in the muscle length is picked up by these muscle spindles. And once that happens, only the inner part of the muscle changes. Now the whole muscle needs to contract. So for that, what happens is the muscle spindles send afferent messages to something called as the gamma motor neurons, which are afferent fibers, and they go to the spinal cord, and there is an interneuron which communicates between the afferent, which is the gamma, to the efferent, which is the alpha motor neuron. So the message that okay, there is a change in the muscle is picked up by the gamma motor neurons, then it gets communicated to the alpha motor neurons, which are the efferent fibers, and the alpha motor neurons innervate extrafusal muscle fibers, and they contract and the whole muscle moves so that you're able to stretch the muscle appropriately and grab onto whatever you want. So this is called as a stretch reflex. In short, this is how the neuromuscular control works. So in your study map, I have provided you some information about this, and I also have given you a flowchart. So this is what it basically means. So we will talk more about that in the subsequent slides. Okay. So the tracks of spinal cord. So how does the spinal cord receive information? Basically, it receives information from the primary motor cortex via the descending track. So you know that there are two types of descending tracks, corticospinal and corticonuclear. Now, corticonuclear primarily talks to cranial nuclei in the brainstem, whereas corticospinal further crosses at the level of medulla pyramids, and then it talks to the spinal nuclei. Excuse me. So that's about the corticospinal tracts, and then you have anterior and lateral corticospinal tract. So you see how the lateral make up the bulk of the corticospinal tract. They are crossed and they comprise 90% of the spinal tract. So this is the lateral, and the small percentage actually they do not cross. They are called as anterior corticospinal tract, and they comprise just 10% of the spinal tract, the descending corticospinal tract. So the lateral corticospinal tract is involved in the cortical control of skeletal muscle during skilled movements, and the anterior part is basically uncrossed, and eventually they cross before synapsing on the motor neurons. And also the spinal tract receives input from the extrapyramidal tract They are basically the tectospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract. So these are basically helps in reflexes, and that's the tectospinal. The rubrospinal, rubro means red, so it communicates to red. There is a communication from the red nucleus to the spinal cord, and that helps in regulation of muscle tone for limb extension against gravity. And finally, you have the vestibulospinal, which helps in regulating the body adjustment to stabilize head, and also it helps you to maintain an appropriate posture. That's about the motor part. And then you also have ascending tracts, which basically help you to perceive the senses. So you have fasciculi gracilis and cuneatus. They help in discriminative touch and vibration from the lower and upper halves of the body. And then you have the lateral spinothalamic tract, which helps in mediation of pain and temperature. And finally, you have the spinocerebellar tract. You know, cerebellum is all about posture, equilibrium, so definitely it has to communicate to through the spinal cord, and it helps to perceive unconscious proprioception from muscles of extremities and limbs. So we talked about the motor nuclei, the motor unit. So basically, it's the spinal gray matter, which comprises the motor neurons, and each motor neurons supply efferent impulses to the muscle, and it comprises of the alpha and gamma neurons, the interneurons, which talks to the alpha and gamma neurons, and there are two specialized motor neurons, which are basically for regulating phrenic and accessory nerves. So they are part of, so we know that the only nerve that is responsible, it has an active role in speech production, is the phrenic nerve that innervates the respiratory muscle. And also you have a part of the accessory nerve. Accessory nerve has two components. It has a cranial nerve component and a spinal nerve component. So we know accessory nerve basically helps in elevating the shoulder or maintaining a good posture. So if there is a lesion to the spinal accessory nerve, your shoulders are gonna droop, and that's gonna affect your speech production due to an awkward posture. So this is how the gamma and the alpha motor neurons look like. So the alpha, remember, they drive efferent impulses to the extrafusal muscle fibers. Gamma pick up the afferent information from the muscle spindles or intrafusal muscle fibers, and they communicate to the alpha motor neuron. So let's talk a little bit about the alpha motor neurons. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between alpha motor neurons, cranial nerves, spinal nerves, everything? Remember, the the peripheral nervous system comprises the cranial and spinal nerves. Now, alpha motor neurons can be are usually a part of the spinal nerves that help in movement of the extremities. So the spinal nerve can also be a mix, can also be a sensory nerve, but alpha motor neuron is a specific part of the spinal nerve that helps in production of movement. So it's all about driving down efferent nerves, efferent impulses. And gamma, which still is a part of the spinal nerve, brings about afferent. So alpha motor neurons are major spinal neurons. The diameter is from 9 to 6 and one alpha neuron innervates about 200 muscle fibers. So it has a very high innervation ratio. It is involved in rapid impulse conduction. As I said, this is very important. It innervates the extrafusal muscle fibers, and its function is basically voluntary and reflexive movements of head, trunk, and extremities. And then you have the gamma motor neurons, which are greater in number with smaller diameter. They are the impulses are very slow. That's how they conduct the sensory impulses, and it helps in regulation of spindle fibers length, modulation, excitation of annulospiral primary endings. We'll talk a bit about the annulospiral primary endings very shortly, but these are basically the afferent fibers which innervate the muscle spindles. Remember, I talked how muscle spindles pick up changes in length. It's basically because of the annulospiral endings which circle around the muscle spindles. They are involved in regulating the stretch reflex muscle tone. And then, of course, you have the interneurons, which are numerous specialized cells, and they help to integrate the sensory and motor functions of CNS. Okay. So what's the motor function of the spinal cord? Basically, yeah, we know that it helps in moving your extremities, but a very important part is the reflex response. It's a stereotyped movement to sensory stimulation, and in terms of the reflex, it comprises for any reflex action there should be muscle spindles, afferent fibers, alpha motor neurons, efferent fibers, and of course there should be reflexive contraction of muscle fiber. So we'll talk about how stretch reflex is one of the reflexive functions of the spinal cord. So the reflexive actions are free from cortical voluntary control, but however, it has an indirect influence of motor cortex and brainstem motor centers through descending fibers. So reflex, they said, if the spinal cord waits to get a message from the cortex, then by the time if your fingers are touching a painful stimulus, it might get damaged. So to prevent that extra time, the processing happens locally at the level of spinal cord. Okay, now spindles and motor activity. Let's take a look at how actually the spinal cord communicates with the muscle and how it mediates a reflex or in general a motor movement. Okay. Now, as I said, muscle spindles, they are specialized receptors. They are also muscle spindles are also called as intrafusal muscle fibers. They are specialized receptors to detect degree and rate of muscle length change. So whenever you stretch your hand, of course you're gonna change the length of your muscle, and that change in length of the muscle is picked up by the muscle spindles. And then you also have something called as the Golgi tendon organs. They are pretty much sensitive to the degree of muscle tension. So basically the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs pick up any changes to the muscle, the nature of the muscle. So when it moves, if it is tensed, that's picked up by the Golgi tendon organs, and when it changes in length, it's picked up by the muscle spindles. And the location, as I said, it's in intrafusal muscle fibers. They are parallel to striate muscle fibers, which are the extrafusal muscle fibers. And each intrafusal muscle fibers is wrapped around with something called as annulospiral primary sensory endings. I know it's a mouthful, but just remember annulospiral endings. They are the basically afferent fibers which are wrapped around the intrafusal muscle fibers, which detect the changes in length. And that change in length is communicated to the gamma motor neurons. Okay, let me show you a figure. So you see, basically, these are the different types of intrafusal muscle fibers. You have something called as the nuclear chain, then you have the nuclear bag. So all these fibers, the red lines that are wrapped around the intrafusal muscle fibers are nothing but the annulospiral endings. And then they pick up the changes in length, and that sensory information is passed down to the gamma motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons, as they are afferent in nature, they go and talk, give this information to the interneuron. The interneuron acts as a mediator between gamma and alpha. The interneuron picks up the afferent information from gamma and passes it on to the alpha. The alpha knows that there's a change in length, so the whole muscle has to move accordingly to accommodate that stretch. So the alpha motor neuron picks up that information. It goes and innervates the extrafusal muscle fibers, as you can see here, and they also move. So basically, when the internal is about to move, the external fibers also have to move so that it accommodates the change in length. So that's how basically the stretch reflex or the neuromuscular control works. So these are, as I said, intrafusal muscle fibers basically. So there are different types. You have the nuclear chain fibers, nuclear bag fibers, and irrespective whether it's nuclear chain or nuclear bag, they are wrapped around with the annulospiral endings that pick up the information basically. So it's the same thing. So you have the changes in length picked up by the annulospiral endings wrapped around the intrafusal muscle fibers that talks to the afferent fibers, goes to the interneuron. The interneuron communicates to alpha, which is the afferent fiber. The alpha knows that it needs to change the length of extrafusal muscle fibers to accommodate the change in the length of the muscle. Okay, so there are two types of afferents from spindles. The type 1A, which are the primary annulospiral endings, they are very fast conducting fibers. Then you have type 2, which are shown here. They also help to pick up the changes in length, but however, they are very slow conducting fibers. So that's basically about the spinal, the stretch reflex, which is mediated by the spinal cord.